Yeah, I'm not talking about an act of evil. I'm talking about the very presence of evil, if that can even be a thing we say. Welcome back to Reason Together, the podcast for Christians who think about stuff. I'm Thomas, here with Daniel for another episode.
Good morning.
How are you this morning?
I'm doing well, thank you.
Good. Before we get too much into it here, we want to first thank our patrons over at patreon.com/reasontogether. If you'd like to help support this podcast, we would much appreciate that. And if you're curious what we do with that support, we do have a blog and technical editor that we pay for that, as well as an editor for the audio version of this podcast. And we also are looking to increase a little bit of our blogging world, blogging sphere, blogosphere, is that a word?
Blogosphere actually is a word, yeah.
Yeah, we're looking to kind of support that a little bit better than we're doing, so and keep the content coming for you. So that's what our patrons help support, as well as keeping the lights on reasontogether.fm. So if you'd like to help with that endeavor, we would sure appreciate that. You can go to patreon.com/reasontogether and choose one of the various support levels there. And I don't know if you know this, but even if you chose a support level that was, say, $8 per episode, you can still set a cap on that
per month.
So that if we put out 50 episodes in a month, which would never happen, you're not going to get charged $8 for every single one of those episodes, because you can place a cap on how many episodes per month you support. So there is flexibility there. Even if you wanted to support for $1 or $2 a month, Patreon allows you to do that and customize a pledge. So if you want to check that out, that's over at patreon.com/reasontogether, and we'd be grateful.
All right. Well, glad that you've tuned in again to hear from our deep, rich experience of life, all the answers that you've ever needed. And actually, we're glad that you've sort of joined the conversation and to hear two good friends reason together just about stuff. Well, we've just had an array of questions. And I was thinking as we start today, Tom, what do you think listening to our podcast says about our listeners? I was listening to something the other day, and it was one of those, something like, well, you obviously care because you're listening to this. And I thought, what does listening to our podcast say about our listeners? What do you think?
Well, the first thing that comes to mind is that they like to think. Mm-hmm. They like to talk over issues, which it maybe we take for granted that as not only the hosts of this podcast, but our listeners probably take that for granted as well, that some people out there like to think through what they believe and how it applies to life. There's probably a large swath of professing Christendom that really doesn't do that. Mm-hmm. And probably not far from home in our circles. So I think they're thinking people.
Yeah.
And I think the other thing it says about them is that they have a relationship with truth. And not that we have all the answers all the time. We're thinking through these things on the fly.
Right.
But we're willing to correct ourselves as we see truth from Scripture applied to life. We're willing to think about it. We're willing to be wrong. And I think that's important. And I think our listeners are willing to do that as well. I think there's some honesty there amongst our listeners.
Good. And I also had typed down here that they appreciate good conversation. There really is a value to good conversation, meaningful, mm-hmm. edifying, substantive conversation that talks about things that matter and like you say, was willing to be sharpened. And other than that, they just love the soothing tone of our voices and our wit and our suave, debonair style and things like that. But yeah, so thank you.
One thing my voice has never been called is soothing. Just so you know.
All
no
right.
surprises there.
Okay. Well, if anyone finds Tom's voice soothing, maybe just send in some feedback and say, I do. And
it puts me to sleep all the time.
Yeah, members of Colonial not allowed to comment there. All right. So, okay. Let's get into some of these questions here. We've got some feedback. Believe it or not, we've got two kind of related questions about relationships. And so where do you want to start?
Well, we have been trying to squeeze in this theodicy question for weeks now here.
Okay.
And I feel like we can't put that off anymore.
All right.
Do you want to read that one?
Sure.
And we'll get into it?
Sure. Omar writes, in light of the anniversary of September 11, I was wondering if you could discuss how evil can exist in God's world. Okay, this is a classic question. That's what he calls it. The classic question of the problem of evil asks how an all-good and all-powerful God can permit such evil in his creation. Skeptics say that if God were all good, he would want to stop the evil, and if he were all powerful, he would be able to stop evil. The fact that evil still exists must mean that God is either not all good or not all powerful. How would you answer this? Thank you for the question. Fire away. Fire away at the largest question ever asked and the most popular.
We're going to solve the problem of evil here in just a matter of minutes.
That's right. Just give us about 5, maybe 10 minutes.
No, well, I think as much as we joke about it, we are acknowledging that this is a subject that has captivated thinkers across the spectrum for a long, long time. And there's still really no way to fully understand this. And that, I think, that last sentence I stated, I think plays into my particular view on theodicy. Mm-hmm. But before we can even get into various views of theodicy, we have to begin with the premise of what is evil. What do you think evil is? Mm-hmm. Is it? Well, I don't want to give a leading question here. Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I think to back up a step and the apologetic response to this, and I don't think it's the only response or necessarily the proper initial response, but a response to this is we don't, your framework of if you're trying to say this to disprove God, you disprove the ability to even have the conversation that we're having. You undermine your own conversation. And what I mean by that is that you eliminate God, you eliminate the creator of logic, you eliminate the giver of laws, the determiner of right and wrong. And so now we have to assume on something which there is no good basis for this assumption in naturalistic philosophy that we can even reason together.
Yeah, and you bring up an important point about dealing with this question of theodicy when talking to a skeptic.
Yes, right.
Which is a whole nother conversation, I suppose. However, for the sake of our largely Christian audience, this is still a question that baffles Christians. How do we explain evil to ourselves or to each other? And when it comes to the question, what is evil? There's a couple different views on that. Some view it as a positively created thing, that it's an actual, like if you were to picture the number scale, right? And you look at 0 there, and then everything to the left of that would be negative, and everything to the positive of that would be, positive numbers to the right. Is evil on the positive scale of things, or is evil simply the absence of something else? Is evil simply the absence of goodness? Is that what happens when goodness is absent, if that makes sense? That I think is an important foundational axiom that we have to deal with first when trying to answer the question of theodicy.
Whoa. Yeah, I don't know where to go with that exactly.
Well, I mean, the implications of that are important, because if evil is on the positive scale of things, in other words, to the right of 0, then you're talking about something that had to have been created, right? Whereas if it's on the negative side of the scale, to the left of 0, then it's something that is just the absence of something else, which is a lot easier to explain. Because if we say that evil is a positively created thing, well, then now we have the question, who created it? Why did they create it? And what does it say about them? Right? And if we take it as a positive thing, and we say, well, then Satan had to have created evil, right? Because if God creates evil, then he is evil. If Satan creates evil, then why didn't God stop him, and so on? You get into all of these questions. And this question goes back to Epicurus, a Greek philosopher, ancient Greek philosopher. And he said, is God willing to prevent evil but not able? Then he is not omnipotent. Is he able but not willing? Then he is malevolent. Is he both able and willing? Then whence cometh evil? Is he neither able nor willing? Then why call him God? So all that to say, this is something that has been thought about for a long, long time.
Mm-hmm.
And his entire line of questioning, Epicurus' entire line of questioning, comes from his view that evil is a positively created thing. But if evil is simply the absence of God's goodness, right? If it's the absence of goodness of any kind, that's a lot easier to explain.
Explain it more to me, because I'm not seeing the ease immediately to say the absence of goodness. Like, what does that mean? How can someone, because obviously evil is active. If someone does something evil, they're actively doing evil. So it's not just like I was sitting in my living room and evil was present, right, because nothing was happening, but something actively is happening, and yet it's the absence of something. So explain.
Yeah, I'm not talking about an act of evil. I'm talking about the very presence of evil, if that can even be a thing we say. Right? In the beginning, right, when God created everything, right, sure, there was darkness upon the face of the deep. Did he create the darkness? You know what I mean? Or was the darkness simply the absence of the light God created? Mm-hmm. Does that make sense? And yes. So in that sense, if we view evil as simply the absence of goodness, and we look at all of humanity in light of there being an absence of goodness because of the fall, mm-hmm, then that makes a little more sense. And I'm not sure if I'm explaining it the best way possible, but that makes more sense to me than to say evil is a positively created thing. Well, because then who created it? And if it was God, then he's evil. And if God simply allowed it, why did he allow it?
I think to me, they're sort of they've linked elbows, because linked arms, because on the one hand we say, well, it's the presence of, it's humanity that lacks goodness, and yet that would be my explanation to the positive creation of evil, is that it's the humanity that lacks goodness that
I would say all of creation lacks goodness.
Yeah, in some way, but to say it's those humans that create it when they make their decision, they choose to sin because they're bent. And I guess maybe you're asking where the bent comes from.
Right. Yeah. Why? That's what I mean is why do they do that? Where does that evil nature come from? And you say, well, it goes back to the fall. Okay. Well, then why did that happen? Does that make sense?
I don't know that I'm completely tracking with you, but
okay. Well, to get back to the original statement,
yeah,
I'd said there's something in this conversation I don't think we can understand, mm-hmm, which I think we're kind of circling the drain around that exact point, is something that we cannot understand here. And that kind of factors into my view of theodicy, the one that I think is perhaps the most tenable. And really, I've actually said this on this podcast before, though not using the word theodicy. I've presented my view both in church and on this podcast about this. And essentially, it's the concept of what some might term a big God theodicy.
Okay.
The idea that God is not only all powerful, but he's also all righteous. And that means when he does something that to us we don't understand, like he allows 9/11 to happen, he allows all sorts of evil things to happen, mm-hmm, I trust him anyway, because he's bigger than me and he knows things I don't. And that seems to be, to a skeptic, a cop-out answer. But to the Christian, that answer makes sense, because we understand the place of faith in the Christian life, that we are to walk by faith and not by sight. And that means there are going to be things we don't understand, nor can we have answers to. So I'm comfortable with a big God theodicy. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Does that make sense?
Yeah, basically, there's going to be trying to wrap my mind around the entire concept is trying to encapsulate God too much and not just permitting him to be God. You're saying just understanding that his thoughts are above my thoughts, and I can't comprehend all that he knows and sees and does, and how all that fits together.
Right. And if I can't trust him in those moments when evil happens, in other words, if I say, well, God let this happen and I lost this loved one and now I hate God or what have you, and I can't understand why he allowed this to happen, well, then I have a weak faith. I'm not understanding that God does things behind the scenes that I don't get, or that he has a grand plan that he is working out in the universe. So I would consider that my view, and that's gonna appease some who ask you, and it's going to annoy others.
Yeah,
And we
because
have to know that going in.
because some people just no, I want the answer. I want to understand it. I want to be able to comprehend every part of it. And the fact of the matter is, there's thoughts and truths in Scripture that are presented and in life that we just say, yeah, I can't understand all this, and we have to accept our own finiteness at a certain point, our own
Right.
limitation of thought. I would say probably another, and this would not be my answer to, if somebody's asking you out of grief and out of pain, I don't think the best answer is necessarily an apologetic answer. And by apologetic, I mean apologetics in the defense of the faith, saying, well, blah, 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 and giving this pat answer that, whatever. You have to recognize if a person's hurting, they're in pain, in some ways to recognize the pain and maybe to take your approach to say, we don't understand everything. And in fact, scripture tells us that, it gives us that expectation that we won't understand everything. It tells us that God's thoughts are higher than his thoughts and his ways beyond our ways. His, he, whether it's, I think it's Psalm 139, that he's so much, obviously he is infinite. He's the all wise God. And so there are things we're not going to understand, but he does know your pain. And he does offer a grace that, how does it say it? But my grace is an all sufficient grace, So that would be an answer there. But as far as in a moment of just kind of discussion, if somebody's saying, so what about the problem of evil? One thing is, I think that could color the conversation would be our improper maybe assumption or expectation. And that goes back, I guess, to your discussion of what is evil, because we say, well, because a lot of times we're hurting, and what we're saying is, I didn't deserve that. He didn't deserve that,
Yeah,
So,
I don't think everybody's saying that, though.
Okay,
when they
and
go
maybe
through
not.
something difficult, I think some folks, especially Christian folks, when they go through something difficult, I don't think they're all saying, I didn't deserve that. I think some are simply wondering, why did this happen? And that is a fair question, and it is an honest question if it's asked in the right attitude, as we learn from the book of Job. But I think the emotional explanation that we can give to grieving people is not always going to be good enough for some folks. For some folks, it might be, but other folks really are going to want to know, why evil? Why does God permit evil in the first place? I mean, admittedly, there are people who've gone through horrible, unspeakable things. And they're going to often want to know, why does God allow this? And I think those people, in a sense, should have an answer to that, which kind of begs the question, does God ordain evil ever?
I want to back up to something you said a minute. I'm kind of processing what you're saying here. I'm thinking, because it helps when you say, some people have been through unspeakable evil, to realize, some people truly have been wounded, hurt, that is part of to me, the problem of this discussion is that you don't want to. How was I going to say it? Is sounding too cold, uncaring.
Yeah.
Obviously you've been through something, horrific, and I've never been through it, and I don't understand it. And then I just sort of give you this cold, simple, logical answer that, well, blah, 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 to kind of explain away the pain. However, a lot of it, I feel like, is somewhat of a forgetting that we do live in a sinful world, that we are fallen people, that we innately are self-destructive, and so much of this is brought on. But now when we're hurt by someone else and we say, but why me? Why did God even allow his creature to do that? Well, we can come up with this really, again, very finite explanation to go, well, God wanted people that would choose to love him. Oh, okay. Well, and maybe that's true, but that's not necessarily the whole answer, that he permitted sin to go
Yeah.
on so that people, because they have a free will, and so they choose to sin, and yet they could choose to love him, and he doesn't want robots loving. Okay. But anyway, is there an answer that's really satisfying?
Well, ultimately, no. And that's why I think the big God view of theodicy is ultimately the one that wins the day, is because for the person who walks by faith, that is a sufficient answer. And for those who refuse to walk by faith, or they have an immature faith, that answer is not going to satisfy them. But my point is that while you say there are some that don't want your theodicy answer when they're grieving, there are likely others as well who don't want your emotional comfort when they're grieving. They want an explanation. And when it comes to the matter of theodicy, you kind of touched on this a bit ago, now I can't remember what you said. Let me get back to my question before I forget it, because I think it'll kind of bring us back around to it. Is the question, does God ever ordain evil?
Okay, is that sort of a nuanced question? Like by ordain, is there sort of a...
Does he ever purpose for it to happen? Does he ever decree for it to happen, or ordain for it to happen as part of his plan?
And to put it in kind of popular terminology, is he ever author sin?
No, that's not what I'm asking.
Okay.
I'm asking, for the purpose of his plan, does he plan that evil occur? Does he, perhaps even before the world began, does he ever ordain that something happen a certain way at a certain time by a certain people?
Well,
does he ever ordain it?
Again, I think that's one thing that's beyond our understanding, to say, well, God foreknew everything, so therefore he planned it. That's where some people go, well, no, that doesn't seem consistent. But did he foreknow it? And then does he know that this is the way of the world? And so obviously his plan is going to work through sinful humanity. And it says, he brings Romans 8:28, all things work together for good. So, I mean, obviously that plan includes these all things that are happening, even the bad ones. But is it saying that he's designing, like, I want sin, I want this thing to happen? You know what I mean?
Right. But do you see what I'm asking, though, is, did God simply foreknow the crucifixion would happen, or did he ordain that?
Well, and I think here's a two-sided that. Yeah, I think obviously he ordained that, but I would think there's two sides of that. And it's kind of an explanation I was given to somebody yesterday regarding temptation. On the one hand, we say, God may put you in a test or a trial, to press you, to try your faith, to grow you. That's the intent. Now, the flip side of what we call testing is tempting. And in that test, the flesh can be pulled away by desires to respond adversely to that pressure and become bitter or whatever. So on the one hand, it is a temptation by God, and yet it's not a temptation to evil. It is a temptation to grow you, and yet out of that temptation there can be a temptation to evil. But James says, that God cannot be tempted with evil, neither tempteth he any man. So do you see what I'm saying? The two sides of what God's doing in a pressure, and yet out of that same thing, a man sins, and we go, oh, well, God made him sin. Well, no.
I'm not saying God made the Jews sin in crucifying the Lord, or the Romans. I'm not saying God made them do that.
Right.
But I am saying that we can't deny that to a point God did ordain it to happen. In fact, there's so much prophecy concerning the matter that if it had happened any other way than his side being pierced, or his brow being pierced, or him being buffeted with the hand, if it had happened any other way, then God would not be God. In other words, he ordained it to take place in a specific way, and thus he can ordain things to happen that are evil. And really, it's the only explanation of verses in the Bible that tell us it pleased the Lord to bruise him. Well, how does it please the Lord for someone to be bruised? For something evil to happen? Does that make sense?
Yeah,
there's really no way around that.
It's saying that God doesn't want the man, in essence, to say, he's not contradicting his nature to say, be violent in this situation, be violent, right. And yet he knows that's going to happen, and he's ordained that pressure point to
right.
happen.
Well, because to take the opposite view is to say that the entire crucifixion and redemption of man was a happy accident, and God just simply said, well, I guess I'm okay with it. And that's just not tenable.
Well, yeah, and again, it doesn't make sense in his. I mean, he knew it was going to happen, so nothing is an accident in the sense that, like, well, I didn't see that outcome coming. It's so the wisdom of God and the power of God and the righteousness of God.
But to my earlier point, though, it's not that he just knew it would happen that way. He was the lamb slain before the foundation of the world. And as Peter said in his sermon in Acts, this was by his determinate counsel, which means this was positively determined, right? This was planned, if we were to say it that way. And I know that's an uncomfortable thought, but it really does get to the heart of the question of theodicy, that I don't understand how God can, in his plan, not only allow evil to happen, but know it's going to happen, and this is part of his plan. He can ordain something that he expressly forbids, like murder. Does that make sense?
A little bit. I'd have to think through whether we're parsing that down enough to make it balanced. But
well, it's no different than 1 Peter 3:17, which I think just came up in a recent episode as well, where Peter makes it clear that it is God's will for us to sometimes suffer, right? And we all know that intuitively, but we rarely think about the implications of that. That suffering, my suffering involves someone in some way persecuting me or sinning against me. And yet that was God's will for my life.
Well, see, that's right. But I don't think there's necessarily an inconsistency there when he, if you will, ordains Nebuchadnezzar to take his people. He doesn't ordain Nebuchadnezzar to torture and kill his people, but to captivate them. Well, Nebuchadnezzar goes and just, ransacks and pillages and wipes out everything. And then God's going to turn around and judge Nebuchadnezzar, in part for the manner of treatment, right? So is he ordaining the captivity? Yes. Is he ordaining the sin of the way they were, you know what I'm saying? I mean, is that what you're saying? He's ordaining the outcome, but not the action.
Just to be clear, you're saying God ordained Nebuchadnezzar's judgment because of Nebuchadnezzar's treatment of Israel?
And that seems like, from my reading, at least in part, yes.
Or is it because of his pride?
Well, yeah, that judgment too. You're talking about when he was for 7 years and things like that.
Yeah.
Are
we talking about different judgment?
Yes.
Okay.
I mean, that's what I would think. I don't have the exact reference in front of me on that, but
yeah, all that to say, and I think we would just keep, going round and round on this the more we talk about it, because all we have is examples, right? We can give examples of both sides of this issue. And that's why the big God view of theodicy seems to fit the best, is because we're just not going to understand, but yet we know that God can ordain something to take place that he expressly forbids. Otherwise, the crucifixion was just an accident that he somehow was okay with. The other view of theodicy is, and you've probably heard this from pulpits before, is what some might call the redemptive glory view. That basically God, before the creation, knew that the story of redemption would be the best way to bring glory to himself. That, sin had to happen and man had to fall and Satan had to be the enemy, and God had to step in and redeem them and save them and then defeat Satan and so on, because that is the best way for him to have brought glory to himself. That's what some might call the redemptive glory view. And I'm not opposed to that thought. I just don't think it really explains the best. I think still the big God view of theodicy is the best. Does that make sense?
Well, to me, it's certainly, I mean, it makes sense that the big God view is better, because it just seems to, it seems to say, well, this is what bring God most glory. Basically says, yeah, whatever happens to you, that just glorifies God the most. So that's why he does it. Like, what? I mean, that doesn't sound as comforting as, we just don't understand, that God's working all these things, yes, for his glory, but our good. And
yeah, and it also places the decision for what glorifies God the most into the imagination of man. Really, God can glorify himself any way he chooses to. And who are we to say one way is the best way versus another way? So I think the The redemptive glory view is okay. It can explain some things.
But again, it's
I
sort of
don't
an
think it can.
insufficient man pattern to it. I mean, it's my thought on this, which may be very finite and limited.
Yeah, that's true. And then the third view that I've come across, in fact, someone shared this with me recently, was the God as author view. That God is the author of life and he has the right to write the story as he sees fit. In other words, he's essentially crafting a novel.
Yeah. That sounds a little hyper, yes, hyper
what?
Calvinistic to me, hyper sovereignty. Is that you're just a chess piece. God writes into the story. You feel it. You happen to understand it because you're a sentient creature with intelligence, and He's created you that much. But look, it's predestined. It's deterministic. You're part of the story. Just live it out, brother.
Sure, but I think that there might be a different term you'd use, because frankly, every theodicy solution we've talked about is a sovereign God view. The redemptive glory view is a sovereign God view. The big God theodicy is a sovereign God view. All of them are. But God as author.
And we don't want to explain away the sovereignty of God. Of course He's sovereign.
Right.
I just think
we don't have a problem with that.
I just think some people make Him so sovereign that you really don't have a choice. Just live it out. It's determined. You're part of a grand drama. You don't write the part. Just, anyway, go ahead.
Yeah. Well, the view is basically that, as one writer says here, that that God is the author of a story, and as author, he can have the characters do anything necessary without he himself becoming tainted with evil. Again, I think there are some merits to it. God is writing a story. But I think the where it falls flat is I think people can take this view and kind of do what they want with it. And I don't like leaving that many holes in something, right? Whereas the big God theodicy view essentially has one hole, and it is
massive hole.
Yeah, I don't understand what God does. I just trust him anyway. But anyway, I think that there have been some combination of all of these views presented in independent fundamental Baptist pulpits for generations. We've heard all of these in some shade, in some way, shape, or form. But I think some combination of them is perhaps a good view. But I think the big God theodicy view has to take the cake here.
I would say that'd be, if I had to choose one of the three, that'd be my preference. Though I couldn't yet comfortably use the terminology that God ordains what He otherwise prohibits. That seems to introduce an inconsistency into God's nature that I can't accept yet. But
well, maybe it's the big God theodicy that you need. I don't know.
Yeah.
But I mean, I just don't know how else.
That hole that I don't understand.
Yeah, I just don't know how else we would explain the crucifixion. I don't know how else we would explain that it's God's will for His people to sometimes suffer. I don't know how else we can explain that without saying that God wants this to take place, but it's also something He expressly forbids. And that's a difficult thing. That's hard to be understood, we might say. But without it, the crucifixion is just silly.
And I'm not. It's just I understand that those things exist and trying. But is there a way to explain it where God recognizes, or God ordains the outcome of that thing without ordaining the specific sins that go into it? I'd have to think over that. But good. Thank you, Tom, for your thought on that. You've obviously done some thought and research there.
Sure.
Did we hit that one?
I think so. I mean, we could probably talk, several episodes on this alone, and probably still not get anywhere.
Yeah. Right.
But we can move on if you'd like to. Yes.
Let's see here. Okay, so maybe related to that in some way, we say God is immutable, right?
Mm-hmm.
He's unchanging. He's faithful. He's true to Himself, and things like that. He's firm. That's the so with that being said, he's faithful, he's unchanging. I know that he'll never change. Does that mean that he's predictable?
I think to some degree, yes. To some degree.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason why I say that is because, honestly, when you're talking about predictability, I think you're talking about, at least in some sense, a form of the word faithful.
Okay.
As used scripturally,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Right. That.
The idea that there's consistency.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Pastor Dietrich used to describe it, or he probably still does, as every time I go to start my car,
Yeah.
if it starts only 2 times out of 3, would you say that car is faithful? No. Or if I turn the lights on in the house and the lights come on, 2 times out of 3, are those lights faithful? No, they're not. Faithful means that it does the same thing every time, that it is in some sense predictable. And frankly, I'm thankful for the stability of the Christian life, that we can learn the mind of Christ, in a sense, learn how he thinks about things and how he does things, how he operates. We can learn his design for the world and design for life without there being some degree of predictable faithfulness of God. I don't even know what we have as Christians.
Good. And yet you say to some degree and in some way. What's the drawback? Why do you not say that he's absolutely predictable?
Well, kind of in a sense, and I think this may be the connection you saw between this and the question of theodicy a moment ago, is because I don't think we can predict everything he's going to do in our life.
Good. Right. And so that's where, and that was maybe a little bit of my struggle in the last question, was knowing that he is always consistent to his nature. How do you describe something that looks like his actions are not? But yes, that's exactly it, is that he's always true to his nature. He is who he is. And that character, that goodness of him is not going to change. And we can know that he'll always be the most powerful, the all powerful. His grace will, always be sufficient, whatever. But there are verses like Romans 11:34 says, "For who hath known the mind of the Lord, or who hath been his counselor?" There are going to be times when we don't, like you said, know what he's going to do. When
Right.
Hebrew boys stood in front of Nebuchadnezzar and said, "Our God is able to deliver us from this fire, and he will deliver us. But if not," and there was that introduction that it's not that he may not be able to pull through, but that maybe I don't entirely understand everything he means to do here. So they were recognizing their own lack of knowledge of God's plan, though it's not a lack of confidence in who God was.
Yeah, well, if God was utterly predictable by us, I think that really smashes the concept of his deity in the first place, because it, in a sense, puts us on par with being able to understand God fully, and I think really that's what people are looking for when they get into like numerology. They have this belief that God is absolutely so utterly predictable that we can find the numbers, we can do the math, right? And yet what we can't explain is why it is that some people who live a godly Christian life, they end up with tragedy, and other people who live like Christian pigs, they end up, seemingly blessed of the Lord with all sorts of opportunities and material things and so on. And we look and we say, that doesn't make sense. Shouldn't that be predictable? Well, no, that is, in a sense, a lot of the conclusions of the book of Job is that God is not predictable in this sense, because Job seemed like the least deserving guy to get that sort of treatment. But yeah, so yeah, I think God is predictable. Otherwise, we have no place for faith in him, right? But at the same time,
right.
we don't always know what he's going to do or why he does it.
Yes.
And it doesn't often make sense.
Right. So that's good. And as you said that, I thought, whoa, Job might be the best answer to the theodicy question. Right there. When you say he's the least deserving, obviously went through, traumatic events. And yet we know the story, we understand, but how would you have answered Job? Anyway, that's good. Okay. So, listeners, if you have any feedback there, it's reasontogetherpodcast@gmail.com. Just if you're going to answer the entire question of theodicy and solve it once and for all, maybe send it in multiple emails. and give us how many pages would that be? It would be, you couldn't. Yeah. Okay. Anyway.
Yeah.
So
it would crash the internet.
Yeah. Just don't text it to Tom, the answer, or to me.
Don't.
Like bling, bling,
And
bling, bling,
I'll curmudgeon
bling,
anyway.
bling.
Don't text me.
So if you have a thought on theodicy or is God predictable, an example you want to share, a thought maybe we didn't quite cover, there's an angle that would just help the discussion, feel free to share it with us, reasontogetherpodcast@gmail.com. I think we're just about there, Tom. We're probably going to have to let it go and transfer into the after show here. And so again, thank you for listening. If you're interested in the after show, it's available to elite patrons at patreon.com/reasontogether who sign up at the elite level, then have access to the after show. And if you're not an elite patron, we will see you next time or talk to you next time.
Yeah. All right. Well, we are encouraging balance, developing perspective, and connecting faith to practice, and solving all the world's problems in one unplanned episode at a time. This is Reason Together.